The clock tower above the old London Archive building, a colossal, brutalist structure designed to be forgotten, stopped precisely at 3:17 p.m. on a Monday in 1994. It wasn't mechanical failure. It was the moment the timeline broke. Marcus Hale didn't deal in time travel. He dealt in dust and depreciation. As a contracted archival specialist, his job was to catalog and destroy the decommissioned remnants of a clandestine government facility, a repository rumored to have served MI6 during its most paranoid Cold War years. The bunker, located deep beneath what was once a civic records office, was a labyrinth of moldering concrete and rusted steel shelves. It was a place where information went to die. But in sublevel B2, Sector Delta, Marcus found a vault sealed not with combination locks, but with a thick, polymer resin, a chemical seal that screamed, "Keep out," louder than any sign. After days of careful work, he broke the seal. Inside was not gold or state secrets, but VHS tapes. Hundreds of them, unmarked, stacked floor to ceiling in climate-controlled metal lockers. They were all uniformly labeled with a single year, 1994. Marcus, operating under strict protocol to salvage anything of historical value, pulled a random tape. The label, written in neat, bureaucratic script, read, BBC News Special Report, November 7, 1994. He returned to his makeshift office above ground and loaded the tape into an old, bulky professional-grade VHS player he kept for such tasks. The video quality was superb, crisp, vibrant, professional. The familiar BBC logo appeared. The news anchor, a man named Jeremy Finch, smiled reassuringly. "Good evening," Finch began, his voice calm and authoritative. "We begin tonight with the historic signing of the Global Peace Accord in Sydney, marking the official end of the 30-year conflict in the South Pacific. World leaders hail this as a new dawn." Marcus paused the tape, confusion giving way to a sudden, cold dread. There was no 30-year conflict in the South Pacific in the 1990s. The major conflicts of that decade were well documented and geographically different. He pressed play. The second story detailed the coronation of Prince Edward, a man who, in this reality, was still a minor royal decades away from the throne. The third story featured a triumphant address by a different president of the United States, a woman who Marcus had never seen, delivering a speech about the launch of a new, clean global energy grid, a technology that, in reality, was still 15 years away from being conceived. Marcus sat back, the faint static of the VHS tape filling the silent room. These were not simply fake news reports. The clothing, the cinematography, the subtle shifts in the background architecture visible through the studio window, it was all perfectly 1994, yet fundamentally wrong. This tape was a window into a failed future. Phase 1, the chronology of erasure. Marcus spent the next 2 days watching the tapes, meticulously documenting the timeline they presented. The events were detailed, consistent, and followed a logical, coherent historical path. A path where major global catastrophes were averted, where technology was decades ahead, and where the world was, frankly, better. He labeled this timeline Gamma. His current reality, defined by the disasters and delays he knew, was timeline Alpha. The archive of false tomorrows was a chronological log of timeline Gamma. But as Marcus delved deeper, the tapes started to show signs of stress. On the third day, a tape documenting the successful colonization of Mars in 2005 began to warp. Not physically, the magnetic strip remained intact, but the images themselves began to shimmer. The human figures in the broadcast became slightly distorted, their movements jerky, their faces subtly wrong. Marcus brought the corrupted tape to his analytical lab. He scanned the magnetic strip at a molecular level, expecting degradation. But the strip was pristine. However, the analysis revealed something else. A temporal distortion field embedded within the magnetic particles of the tape itself. The tapes weren't merely recordings of a failed timeline. They were physical remnants of it. And by viewing them, Marcus was introducing the magnetic signature of timeline Gamma directly into the framework of timeline Alpha. The timelines were fighting. The shimmer he saw was timeline Alpha's structural integrity resisting the memory of Gamma. Our reality was actively rejecting the memory of a better future. Phase 2. The timeline's resistance. The resistance began to affect Marcus directly. He started experiencing chronological dissonance. Minor details of his life, where he parked his car, which brand of coffee he preferred, the exact color of his shirt, would shift subtly during the day. He'd open a drawer and find an object that wasn't there before, or a familiar object would vanish. The most terrifying dissonance occurred when he looked out the archive window. For a few seconds, the familiar London skyline, the Shard, the Gherkin, would dissolve, replaced by the skyline from the Timeline Gamma tapes. Futuristic, clean, and dominated by colossal, clean energy generators. Then, with a painful snap behind his eyes, the real London would return. The tapes weren't just showing him a different reality. They were tearing a hole in his own. He tried to stop watching. He put the tapes back into the vault and resealed the resin door. But the next morning, when he returned, the vault door was open. Not broken, not forced, but perfectly, cleanly ajar. A single, crucial tape lay on the floor outside the vault. It was labeled, Final Broadcast, December 31st, 2024. The date was only 6 months away from the present. Marcus knew he couldn't leave it. This tape held the key to how Timeline Gamma ended. He loaded the tape, his hands shaking. The image on the screen was almost pure static, the sound a horrific, undulating electronic whine. But through the interference, he saw a single image. Jeremy Finch, the news anchor, sitting in the dark, his face covered in sweat and terror. Finch was not delivering the news. He was whispering. They knew. They knew they couldn't sustain it. The perfection was too costly. We were warned, but we didn't listen. The only way to save the world, Marcus, was to break it. To erase the beauty, to introduce the chaos. You are watching our execution. This timeline must be overwritten to save the existence of existence. The image dissolved into complete, blinding static, accompanied by a sound that made the concrete walls of the archive vibrate violently. Phase 3, the execution of Gamma. Marcus scrambled to shut down the player, but the power button was locked. He looked back at the vault entrance. The concrete walls of the corridor were visibly warping. The tiles were lifting. The entire structure of Timeline Alpha was beginning its violent rejection process. He understood now. Timeline Gamma wasn't a failed timeline. It was a perfect timeline. So perfect, so ordered, so free of the necessary chaos and entropy that defines reality, that it had become unstable. Project Kronos, or its equivalent in Gamma, had realized that the only way to save all of existence from the imminent collapse of their perfect, ordered timeline was to sacrifice it. They deliberately introduced a corruption, a virus of imperfection, that resulted in the chaotic, messy, flawed reality of Timeline Alpha, our reality. The VHS tapes were not a record of a future that failed. They were the recorded memory of a necessary sacrifice, a wound in time left open for one purpose, as a warning. The static grew louder, tearing at the physical components of the room. The CRT monitor exploded in a flash of bright, blinding purple light. The impact sound was absorbed instantly, replaced by the continued, silent scream of the electronic feedback. Marcus realized his error. The tapes were not meant to be found. They were meant to be left sealed. By playing them, he wasn't just viewing the failed future. He was potentially undoing the successful sacrifice. He was introducing the memory of perfection back into the chaotic reality, risking the collapse of Timeline Alpha. He needed to destroy the magnetic evidence. He lunged for the scattered tapes, but the temporal distortion was too strong. The steel shelves twisted violently inward, throwing a torrent of concrete dust into the air. He escaped the room just as the vault entrance collapsed. Marcus ran through the underground corridors. The air pressure was fluctuating wildly. The fluorescent lights were not flickering. They were burning out one by one, leaving colossal, terrifying shadows that stretched and snapped like whips. He made it back to his makeshift office above ground. The London skyline was still the same. The people outside were walking normally. The timeline held. He never went back to the archive. The government sealed the entire building 3 days later, citing structural integrity issues. Marcus lives a normal life now, but he carries a wound. He knows the timeline he inhabits is inherently broken. He knows the world could have been better, cleaner, more peaceful. But sometimes, when he looks at the chaotic, messy streets of London, he hears a faint, distant whisper, the voice of Jeremy Finch, and sees a momentary, clean shimmer over the concrete. He knows the tapes are still there, deep below the surface. And he knows that the sacrifice was made for a reason. We live in a broken world because a perfect world was too fragile to survive.